Okay, uh, the point I was coming here for, I had another point for slide 8 where you talk about eternal. I don't know if you want to go there now.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, so you're using necessity in this argument, and there are different kinds of necessity.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So like in
Yeah.
the ontological argument or the model ontological argument, we use metaphysical necessity, and here we are using something that's similar, or it seems similar, but I think there are some differences. So
Yep.
what's the connection between the necessity here, so a non-contingentness, and necessity in the sense of metaphysical necessity?
That's a perfect a perfect question. So, and I tried to like kind of make the distinction at the beginning, and I'm really glad that you caught on to it. So when you say that something, typically, when you say that something is necessary, all you're saying is that it exists in all possible worlds. That's like all you're saying. And so, for example, let's suppose that God does exist, so He exists in all possible worlds, and in all possible worlds, He really likes, say, jars of green marbles. And so he creates a jar of green marbles, the same jar of green marbles in every possible world. So that means that the jar of green marbles will be necessary in the sense that it exists in all possible worlds, but it's still possible that it doesn't exist. Well, I guess it wouldn't be possible, metaphysically possible, it doesn't exist in that case, but I guess we would say that God wouldn't create it in all possible worlds because it is contingent. But we can think of things that would be dependent for their existence, but yet necessary. So some theologians, incorrect ones, have thought, for example, that Jesus is the procession of God, and that he's like sort of created by God, the Father. And that would be a relation that would obtain in all possible worlds. And so Jesus would be contingent on the Father for his existence in that case, even though he would be metaphysically necessary, existing in all possible worlds. That's false for a number of reasons. It's not what Christianity teaches. So just clarify that. But some people have said such thing. So we can see that in that sort of a way of phrasing it, you'd have something that depends for its existence on something else, and so it's not the necessary foundation for reality, and yet it exists in all possible worlds. So how does that relate back to what we're saying here? Well, what we're saying here is that when you take contingent objects, and here I'm using the term contingency to mean a thing it's possible that the thing doesn't exist. So we want to say, what about that category? Well, what would explain the things that exist in that category would have to be something that isn't in the category, namely something that cannot possibly not exist. And so the best explanation that I can think of to explain how something would exist in that way is if it's self-sufficient in its existence. It's not dependent on anything for its existence. So you and I, for example, for our continued biological life, we're dependent on a number of things. We're dependent on water, food, oxygen. We're dependent on the electrical bonds in our bodies, between the chemicals and all that. And so we're dependent on all these things. And so because we're dependent on those things, if they don't obtain, then our body goes poof, right? Or we cease biological function or various different terrible things. Well, if a thing isn't dependent on anything, then that means that there's nothing that could fail to obtain to where it would not exist, or there's nothing that would cease obtaining that would result in it ceasing to exist, because it's not dependent on any state of affairs. And so if something exists self-sufficiently, then it will, number one, it'll satisfy our that will sort of explain why it is that it can't fail to exist, because it exists self-sufficiently. It doesn't have any sort of dependencies. And then that will entail that it exists eternally, because since it doesn't have any dependencies, there's no time where those dependencies will be unmet, and so it would continue to exist eternally. Does that sort of make
Okay.
sense?
It's sort of, it was a lot to follow, and it's
Yeah.
like 4 o'clock here, so I might
Yeah.
not.
It's another pseudo point from a pseudo intellectual.
Um, I was wondering if, so I think you answered it, but I will just ask again. Um,
So maybe I'll
would
like
you,
simplify, and I'll just kind of like simplify the point. So what we're looking for is something that cannot fail to exist.
Mm-hmm.
So then for me, why is that? Why is it that it can't fail to exist? Right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like we should be able to answer that question. And so I can only think of, maybe there's other options. I can only think of one. And that's that it exists self-sufficiently. And if something exists self-sufficiently, then that has a number of different entailments. So what I mean by it exists self-sufficiently is that it has no dependencies. It doesn't depend on anything for its existence or for its continued existence. It has just no dependencies at all. Well, that's gonna entail a couple of things. Number one, since it doesn't depend on anything, it doesn't depend on the set of circumstances. And so if it doesn't depend on the set of circumstances, then no matter what the set of circumstances are, it's going to exist because it doesn't depend on the set of circumstances. And so if we think of like the different possible worlds as different circumstances that the world could have, well, this being doesn't depend on the circumstances, and so it would exist in all these possible worlds. And because it doesn't depend on anything for its continued existence, has no dependencies, it will continue to exist throughout all time. It'll never cease existing. And so self-sufficiency both explains why it is that it would exist in all possible worlds, and it also explains why it would exist eternally. And so that's kind of like where I'm at, where I look at, okay, we need something that exists necessarily. And then the explanation below that is it is self-sufficient or lacking of dependencies in its existence. And then that implies both that it exists in all possible worlds and that it exists throughout time in any worlds where there is time.
Okay. Okay. You sort of answered my question. I'm still wondering, like, okay, you make the case that self-sufficiency would also imply continued existence, but I'm not
Yeah.
too sure about that. Like, I can imagine that uh, the problem of the contingency argument could be solved with a being that necessarily exists at some point, but can vanish at some point as well, but has existed at some point to start the chain of contingency or whatever you want to call it. So
Yeah. So
what would you make out of that?
in the way that I'm presenting the argument here in this presentation, if it's possible that it ceases to exist, then it seems like it's clearly possible for the thing that it could not exist because there's a time in which it doesn't exist. And so what that would imply is that there's some possible world in which it doesn't exist. And so it wouldn't be necessary in that case. And Josh Rasmussen makes a similar claim where he makes an argument saying that nothing that's material could exist necessarily because the fact that there is at least some spatial area, so we can define some region of space where that thing doesn't exist, that gives us reason to think that it's possible it doesn't exist because there's this region of space over there that it doesn't exist. And so that would give us reason to think that it's possible it doesn't exist. And so therefore, nothing material, because it exists spatially extended at a particular place, nothing material could be necessary in existence. And so I think the same thing works with time, with its necessary being, is that even if we set aside whether it's material or immaterial, if there's a region of time in which it doesn't exist, then that would give us reason to think that it's possible it doesn't exist at all, because at that region of time it doesn't exist at all. And so then that would give us reason to think that there's some possible world in which it doesn't exist at all, and thus it wouldn't be metaphysically necessary. It would be only exist in perhaps a lot of possible worlds, but not all of them.
I'm wondering if that's really a problem. Like, I agree it wouldn't be necessary in the sense you're using here. But if we say that it's necessary that it exists at some point, then we solve the problem of it could have never existed because it's necessary that it exists at some point.
Yeah, but then you're it's just brute at that point, right? So there's no reason for it to exist at that point, right? So you need some explanation. So if it exists at some point but not others, then there is some explanation for why it exists at these points and not others. And that explanation would have to transcend it because it not only explains the region where it exists, but also explains the region where it doesn't exist. And it can't be an explanation. If it doesn't exist, it can't be an explanation for things. And so if there's some region where it exists and some region where it doesn't, then there would need to be a transcendent explanation to explain both those regions, why those regions are defined, where they're defined, that sort of thing. And so I don't think that I think that sort of kicks the can down the road, because then we'd say, okay, well, then we need some transcendent necessary explanation that isn't so constrained.
Could a self-explained being make itself vanish? Or
No.
yeah.
If it doesn't have any dependencies, then there wouldn't be any dependency that it could, pull out in order to make it cease to exist. So, for example, if there's no gravity, can you knock down dominoes? Well, no. You can push them, I suppose. You can't knock them down because there's no gravity, so there's no down. And so, in the same way, if this being has no dependencies, then you wouldn't be able to destroy it because it doesn't depend on anything. So there's nothing for you can't pull the rug out from under it because there's no rug, that it's relying on. And so there would be no reliance that you could unwind, so to speak.
It's reliant on itself, isn't it? Like,
No.
it's self-sufficient, so it's
So relying on itself strikes me as incoherent. So to say that I'm saying when I say self-sufficient, what I mean is it has no dependencies.
Yeah.
Including on itself. It's not dependent on itself. It's just not dependent on anything. It has no dependencies. I don't know what it would mean to be dependent on yourself. So I guess I don't know what that means to say if that would obtain here or not. But I would say that it just has no dependencies.
Mm.
But yeah, we're a little bit past time, so I'll kind of
Yeah.
give you the last word, and then I guess we'll both go to sleep.
Good idea. Yeah, as always, thanks for having me. Interesting presentation, conversation as always, and happy to be back in the next.
All right, sounds good, Kevin. Thanks so much, and yeah, have a great evening, and thanks Reacts for showing up as well, and yeah, have a Merry Christmas if I don't talk to you.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe. Please also look at the show notes in order to find a link to our group so that you can join our next discussion. I look forward to chatting with you.